For decades, fans clung to the official story. A tragic accident, a mid-air fire, a beloved icon lost too soon. That was the version of Ricky Nelson's death that made headlines on New Year's Day in 1986. It was clean, tragic, and convenient. But as the years went on, the details didn't quite sit right. The whispers didn't stop. People close to Ricky spoke in vague tones. Rumors took on lives of their own. And the deeper you looked, the clearer it became. This wasn't just a freak accident. It was a disaster waiting to happen. And someone let it happen. Ricky Nelson wasn't just another fallen celebrity. He was one of the most beloved entertainers of his era, America's golden boy. From the moment he was old enough to speak on camera, he was living in the spotlight. He grew up on television, charmed millions with his voice, and helped shape the sound of early rock and roll. He wasn't just talented, he was trusted. People grew up with him. They saw him as clean-cut, steady, the kind of guy nothing bad could ever happen to. But behind that image was a complicated life, filled with pressure, control, heartbreak, and ultimately, a fate that no one saw coming. So when his plane went down that night, the world mourned, but it also moved on. The story wrapped itself up too neatly. A faulty heater, a doomed flight, case closed. But what if the real cause was buried beneath years of silence? What if someone had ignored warnings, looked the other way, while a dangerous aircraft carried one of America's most iconic stars to his death? Now, after years of speculation, expert investigation, and long-buried evidence coming to light, the full truth has finally been revealed. And it's darker than anyone imagined. Ricky Nelson wasn't just born into fame, he was fame. From the moment he could walk, he was part of the Nelson family empire, starring alongside his parents on the adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. It wasn't just a TV show, it was America's idealized version of family life, and Ricky grew up smack in the middle of it. Week after week, millions of viewers watched him transform from a shy kid into a teen idol with the kind of effortless charm that couldn't be taught. But unlike other child stars who faded into obscurity, Ricky didn't just survive the spotlight, he thrived in it. By the time he released his first single, a cover of I'm Walkin', he wasn't just a familiar face, he was a national obsession. Girls screamed, parents approved, and radio stations couldn't play his songs fast enough. Hits like Hello Mary Lou, Travelin' Man, and Poor Little Fool cemented his place as one of the pioneers of early rock and roll. And while other rock stars leaned into rebellion, Ricky played it clean, charming both teenagers and their parents in a way few others ever could. But behind that smooth voice and clean-cut image was an artist who refused to be boxed in. As musical tastes changed in the 60s, Ricky took a risk, shifting away from pop stardom and leaning into a more authentic, country rock sound. It wasn't the safe move, but it was the honest one. And with the formation of the Stone Canyon Band, he helped lay the foundation for a genre that would later be perfected by groups like the Eagles. His 1972 hit, Garden Party, said it all. You can't please everyone, so you've got to please yourself. Ricky wasn't just a product of the system, he was quietly pushing back against it. But while his career evolved, the image the public adored remained frozen in time. And that disconnect would slowly begin to take its toll. To the outside world, Ricky Nelson seemed to have it all. A thriving career, a loyal fanbase, and a family legacy rooted deep in American entertainment. But behind the scenes, things weren't nearly as polished. Ricky's mother, Harriet Nelson, wasn't just his co-star, she was a dominant force in both his personal and professional life. She had strong opinions about the kind of woman her son should marry, and she wasn't shy about voicing them. Many of Ricky's early relationships ended under pressure, not because they lacked chemistry, but because they didn't meet Harriet's standards of class, control, or public image. Eventually, Ricky found someone who did, Kristen Harmon, daughter of football legend Tom Harmon and actress Elise Knox. It was a match made in Hollywood royalty, and their 1963 wedding seemed like a perfect union of two American dynasties. The press loved it, fans adored it, and Harriet approved. They quickly had 4 children, and from the outside, it looked like Ricky had secured both a stable home and the next chapter of his legacy. But perfection, as always, came with a cost. While the public saw a fairy tale, behind closed doors, Ricky and Kristen were navigating growing tensions. His life on the road took a toll. Her struggles with the pressures of family and fame only deepened. And as the years passed, the emotional distance between them widened into something far more damaging than either expected. They kept up appearances, smiled for the cameras, and tried to hold it together. Still, cracks were beginning to show. What started as a dream was slowly becoming a balancing act between expectation and reality. And as the tension built at home, Ricky poured more of himself into his career, desperate to reclaim the spark that had once made him a star. By the late 1970s, the illusion had completely unraveled. Ricky and Kristen's marriage, once hailed as a symbol of Hollywood stability, was coming apart at the seams. Ricky had thrown himself into touring, chasing musical reinvention and hoping to reignite his momentum. But life on the road meant more time away from home, and more emotional distance from Kristen. Meanwhile, she was left behind to manage the growing responsibilities of their household, battling her own struggles in silence. What had started as a slow drift soon became an open fracture, with resentment, loneliness, and exhaustion filling the space in between. Whispers of infidelity circulated on both sides. Friends and insiders described a marriage fraying under the weight of unmet expectations, personal demons, and the relentless scrutiny of fame. Ricky, once the picture of composure, had become more withdrawn. His music took on a more somber tone, reflecting the sadness he couldn't always express out loud. Kristen, caught between motherhood and emotional burnout, grew distant and bitter. They tried to fix things, to hold on for the sake of the children. But some wounds don't heal just because the cameras are off. By 1982, it was over. The divorce was painful, drawn out, and highly publicized. Custody battles, financial disputes, and the question of who would control the family's narrative all played out under an unforgiving spotlight. Ricky was devastated, not just by the end of the marriage, but by how exposed and vulnerable he suddenly felt. He was no longer the heartthrob with a perfect life. He was a single father, a struggling artist, and a man trying to rebuild while the world watched. Still, he pressed on. His music didn't stop. His fans didn't abandon him. And even in the face of heartbreak, he kept moving forward, until one final show would change everything. On December 31, 1985, Ricky Nelson boarded a private plane headed for Dallas, Texas, where he was scheduled to perform at a New Year's Eve concert. It was supposed to be a fresh start, one more chance to do what he loved, to remind the world that he still had it. Alongside him were his fiancée Helen Blair and members of his band. The plane, a World War II-era Douglas DC-3, wasn't flashy, but it was familiar. Ricky had flown in it many times before. What none of them knew was that this flight would be their last. Somewhere near DeKalb, Texas, tragedy struck. Without warning, smoke began to fill the cabin. A fire had broken out mid-air, and there was no time to prepare. Witnesses later described seeing the aircraft trailing smoke before it crash-landed in a field. Miraculously, the two pilots survived, escaping through the cockpit windows. But Ricky, Helen, and 5 others never made it out. They were trapped in the cabin as it was overtaken by flames. Initial reports blamed a faulty heater. Others speculated about electrical failure. But almost immediately, rumors began to swirl. Tabloids hinted at drug use. Some claimed Ricky had been freebasing cocaine on board and accidentally sparked the fire himself. It was a damning accusation, and it spread fast. For a public still grieving the loss of an icon, the idea that he'd played a role in his own death felt both shocking and sensational. But Ricky's family and close friends pushed back. They insisted the rumors weren't just false, they were cruel. Toxicology reports later confirmed that there were no drugs or alcohol in his system. And yet, the damage to his image had already been done. The public, fed a cocktail of tragedy and scandal, moved on. But behind the scenes, questions remained. Because if drugs weren't the cause, then what really happened on that plane? In the aftermath of the crash, Ricky Nelson's family wasn't just grieving a devastating loss, they were also fighting to protect his legacy from being buried under false narratives. Despite the toxicology report clearing his name, the whispers of drug use clung to the story like smoke. Tabloids printed it. Late-night talk shows joked about it. And for years, the public believed that Ricky may have caused the fire himself, even though there was never a shred of evidence to support it. The theory had legs because it was easy. It fit a pattern people had come to expect from fallen celebrities: fame, decline, self-destruction. But that narrative was lazy, and it was wrong. Ricky wasn't spiraling out of control. He was working, planning, rebuilding. He had a fiancée by his side, a loyal band behind him, and shows lined up for the new year. This wasn't the final act of a man falling apart. It was a comeback in motion. Still, no one could answer the central question: how did a seemingly functional plane erupt into flames mid-air? And if the heater was the issue, why had nothing been done to fix it before? For nearly 2 decades, those questions sat unanswered. The official cause was vague. The investigations stopped short, and everyone involved, mechanics, flight operators, even the surviving pilots, stayed mostly silent. It wasn't until years later that new voices began to dig deeper. Aviation experts, journalists, and former industry insiders started asking the questions that had been brushed aside. They went back to old maintenance records. They tracked down witnesses. They examined what the original investigators had missed or ignored. And what they found would rewrite everything the public thought they knew about that crash. Because the truth wasn't about drugs or bad luck, it was about negligence. The kind that doesn't just break hearts, it ends lives. When investigators finally dug deep enough, what they uncovered wasn't a scandal. It was something worse. It was a case of systemic failure, overlooked warnings, and human negligence so blatant it felt criminal. The Douglas DC-3 that Ricky Nelson boarded that night wasn't just old, it was dangerous. The aircraft had a long, troubling history of mechanical issues, especially with its heater. Multiple pilots had complained about it. Maintenance logs flagged recurring problems. And yet, flight after flight, it kept going up into the sky. The heater had been jerry-rigged with makeshift repairs that didn't meet basic safety standards. It was mounted directly beneath the cabin floor, right next to flammable materials, and lacked proper insulation. No fire extinguisher, no fire retardant lining, no failsafe. It was a ticking time bomb, one that had already given warning signs long before that final flight. But instead of grounding the plane and addressing the danger, the operators chose to keep flying. On December 31, 1985, the inevitable happened. The faulty heater ignited. Fire spread fast, thick smoke filled the cabin, and within seconds, the passengers were overwhelmed. According to forensic reports, Ricky and the others likely died from smoke inhalation before the plane even touched the ground. They never had a chance. Only the pilots, shielded in the cockpit and able to escape through the windows, made it out alive. The most chilling part of this story isn't just how preventable it was, but how many people knew the risk and did nothing. This wasn't an unpredictable tragedy. It was the result of cutting corners, ignoring red flags, and treating safety as an afterthought. And Ricky Nelson, an artist, a father, a man trying to start fresh, paid the ultimate price for someone else's recklessness. When the truth finally came out, it didn't feel like justice. There were no arrests, no headlines holding anyone accountable. Just a quiet, devastating realization that Ricky Nelson hadn't died because of fate, personal failure, or some reckless decision. He died because people who were supposed to protect him, people tasked with ensuring that aircraft was safe, chose convenience over caution. It was a death born out of carelessness, one that could have been prevented with a single decision to do the right thing. For his family, that truth was harder to swallow than any rumor. The years they spent defending Ricky from false accusations, the stain of tabloid lies, the cold silence from official reports, it all pointed to a system that failed at every level. He wasn't lost in a storm of personal chaos. He was stolen by negligence. And for fans who had admired him since childhood, who had grown up with his music, his TV show, his iconic smile, this wasn't just a tragic ending. It was betrayal. Ricky's legacy deserved better. He helped shape American pop culture. He brought rock and roll into suburban homes. He gave his life to his art, even when the industry tried to box him in. And yet, in the end, that same industry stood by while a man who had once lit up every room he entered was flown to his death in a machine that should never have left the ground. The crash didn't just extinguish a rising comeback, it left behind a dark stain that no amount of nostalgia could erase. Because once you know the truth, the story changes. Ricky Nelson wasn't just another celebrity tragedy. He was a man failed by the very system that built him up. And the silence that followed his death wasn't respectful, it was damning. Ricky Nelson spent his entire life under the glow of the spotlight. From childhood, he was a familiar face on black and white television sets across America. He wasn't just a performer, he was part of the family for millions of viewers. They watched him grow up, fall in love, chase stardom, and become one of the most successful teen idols in music history. But what made Ricky stand out wasn't just his voice, or his clean-cut image, it was his quiet persistence. He never needed scandal to stay relevant. He let the work speak for itself. And yet, when he died, the headlines told a different story. His legacy was overshadowed by rumors, vicious, baseless, and completely at odds with the kind of man he truly was. Instead of honoring his career or mourning a life lost too soon, people whispered about drugs, recklessness, and self-destruction. The public didn't just lose an icon, they were handed a lie to make the tragedy easier to dismiss. But the truth is, Ricky Nelson didn't go out in flames because of poor choices. He died because someone else made those choices for him. Choices rooted in laziness, shortcuts, and unchecked negligence. This wasn't a mysterious accident. It was a series of preventable failures. The kind that could happen to anyone who trusts the wrong people to do the right thing. Ricky boarded that plane to perform, to do what he'd always done, give people a piece of himself through music. Instead, he became the victim of a broken system. And that's the most painful part of this entire story. Not that he's gone, but that his death was so avoidable, that someone knew the risk, that someone let it happen anyway. What's left behind is more than just sorrow. It's a warning, a reminder that fame doesn't protect you, that being beloved doesn't make you safe, and that even the brightest stars can fall, not because they lost their way, but because they were failed by others. Ricky Nelson's legacy still lives in the music, the performances, and the memories he left behind. But now, we also carry the truth, and it's heavier than any rumor ever was. He didn't deserve the ending he got, but the world deserves to know how, and why, it really happened.